Maybe it's just me, but I was thinking about this week, that I have this propensity at times to allow my mind to just run wild. A thought will come and I'll just allow my mind to race on that very thing. It's like I see it from, A to B to C to D, E, F, G, and man, next thing I know, I'm all the way on Z. And I've spent 10, 15, 20 minutes ruminating on something. And usually it's not something good. Usually it's something that I'm worried about, something that's concerning me. I like to say it this way. I'm trying to worry myself into a solution. Do I have anybody here that would say, you know what, Pastor Steve, I'm with you on that. I find myself letting my mind race. Sometimes I feel like I'm stressed. I don't realize at times I've got a little migraine or a headache. My jaw's tight, and I didn't realize I was clenching my teeth. I know I'm speaking to some of you here today, but I want you to know that you're not alone and that this is something that many people deal with. And the title of today's message is Stopping the Racing Mind. Stopping the racing mind. And this is something that I believe is going to set you free if you'll grab a hold of it today. Because in this message, this is my hope, is that we understand that there is the spiritual dynamic of life, but then there's this practical dynamic as well. And being one who grew up in church and one that was more of a Pentecostal edge, everything was about the Spirit. It's about the Spirit. It's about the Spirit. And many times we neglected just the practical aspects of life. But then there's also been this push over years where people are so practical in their faith that they think that they can save themselves, that they can deliver themselves, they can heal themselves without God being involved. And I want you to know that God designed it to be both ways. That he wants to bring a word today that is going to be very spiritual, that is going to build your faith, but is also going to impart some practical tools that's going to help you to put this thing together and stop the racing mind. This message was inspired, it was about a week or two ago. My daughter, she sent me this picture, if I can get this up on the screens. And this is my grandson, Micah. He's 5 years old. I love this kid. And little Micah Romano, and you see him, and if you haven't figured out what he's doing, he's excited because he's starting kindergarten. How many of you guys have kids that are starting school, that just started school, right? It doesn't matter if it's kindergarten. But this picture, at first, I was like, this is so exciting, and I hearted it, and I loved it, and I liked it, and I sent back a little quick text, oh man, I'm super excited. Lindsay, this is so awesome. But I can't lie. That in the moment when I saw this picture, it stirred up some emotions in me. And it wasn't like, oh, I want to cry. Oh, he's 5. No, it wasn't that. It actually made me a little nervous. There was this irrational fear that kind of gripped my heart, this irrational kind of worry. And I was like, what is this all about? And I realized that seeing that picture transported me back to the day when we were making decisions about our children going to school. I was thinking, oh man, do we send them to private school? Do we send them to public school? Do we homeschool them? And we had some tough decisions to make. But in those days, I was worried and my mind would race when I thought of my children. Things like this. We don't want to school them and mess them up. How many of you have ever had that thought? But yet I didn't want to send them to this other crazy nut job teacher that was going to screw them up either. So it's like, well, what do we do? Well, what if there's bad kids there at that school? Are those kids going to corrupt my kids? Is it safe for them to even go? Are there parents that are going to, actually be responsible when their kid's sick? They're not going to send them to school and get my kids sick? Are the kids going to pick on my kids? Are they going to be big and are they going to beat them up? And I'm not there to help my kid. And is my kid going to be, angry with me for life? Dad, where were you when I was getting beat up? You're thinking all these thoughts, right? Because once again, I was giving myself over to worry and my mind was racing. And see, there's something that you need to understand. And I've come to realize that if we let our minds race, they're usually going to race in the wrong direction. Let me say it again. That I've come to realize that if we let our minds race, they're usually going to race in the wrong direction. And the Apostle Paul, he sheds some light on this. He brings some clarity to you and I in Philippians 4, if we can go there. Bye, Micah. In Philippians 4, 6-7, it says this. Okay, now let me set this up. Paul is in prison and he's about to really see his fate. He may be executed, okay? So this guy's in a tough spot. If anybody's got something to worry about, he's got something to worry about. But listen to what he says in the face of that situation. He says, do not be anxious about anything. But in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. What an amazing thought. Here he is facing a tough situation and says, you know what? Don't be anxious about anything. You know, I love what Craig Groeschel says. He has this thought, and he says, your life is always moving in the direction of your strongest thoughts. Let that sink in for a moment. Your life is always moving in the direction of your strongest thoughts. The good news is that if your thoughts are zeroed in on the plan of God, his will, on his word, on what he's spoken, prophetic words that have been spoken over your life, if you're zeroed in on that, I'm telling you that you will experience the peace of God which surpasses all understanding. But the bad news, my friend, is that if your thoughts are zeroed in on something else, on this world, if they're zeroed in on how you're going to try to find a solution for something that seems unsolvable, then you're going to find yourself robbed of peace. And not only that, finding yourself going down in a direction that is probably the opposite of what you're believing for. And so what do we do? What do we do with these thoughts? What do we do with this racing mind? Well, today what I want you to get is that I'm going to talk about the practical side, and I hope that this is enlightening to some of you. And I'm going to talk about the spiritual side and how these two things can come together and actually allow this mind to be stable and to be at peace and to be at rest, even if you're in unstable circumstances. So I'm going to talk about the brain a little bit. You guys good with that? I got any science people in here? You guys like hearing stuff about this? So in your brain, we have this thing called the amygdala. Can I get that up? You have the amygdala, and there's more to it, okay? I'm oversimplifying this because, one, I'm not a scientist. Two, we've got 30 minutes. So the amygdala, what it really does at the core of what we would understand is that it drives the fight or flight responses in our lives. That when something comes against you, say you're on the freeway and this big truck starts to swerve into your lane, your amygdala sends off like something, receptors, and you're like, whoa, and it heightens your awareness. It says, watch out, be careful, something's coming over. It's going to run you off the road, and you guys may experience death or trauma or whatever, right? So this little thing, it doesn't exaggerate. It's meant that it's meant for something. God has given it to us, right? But it triggers a response. How many of you guys hate snakes in the room? How many of you guys hate spiders in the room? Anybody else? I don't like spiders. So you see it, right? In that feeling, like, have you ever almost stepped on a snake or seen a spider and it's really close and it shocks you, right? That's the amygdala. It's doing its thing. It's triggering a response to say, get away from that. That's dangerous. It's danger, as Veronica's mom would say, it's danger, mijo. So you're like, I got to get away from it. Veronica and I, we had this really crummy, alarm system in our house years ago. And how do we know it was crummy and how do we know it was faulty? Is in the middle of the night, 2 times at 2 a.m., the alarm system went off. Talk about being terrified, right? You're woken up from a dead sleep at 2 a.m. in the morning to the house alarm going off. So in my mind, I jump up, and what's the thought? There's a home invasion happening right now. My wife is here. My children are in their beds sleeping, and now I got to get up, run down the stairs, and fight somebody for life, right? That's the amygdala. Goes off. It triggers a response. But the reality is it was a broken system. How did I know that? Because I'm still here. And 2, it went off twice. So that was terrifying. But I think about this and how it triggers some of you, and you don't realize it. That you're worrying and your mind is racing right now because you've experienced trauma in life. You've experienced scary things. You've experienced rejection, hurt, and pain. And so when you're confronted with these things, even though they may not be real, but the threat is there, this part of your brain is overactive. When I was a kid, I had this best friend, his name was Jeremy, and his dad was a sheriff. And one day, his dad and his mom, they didn't do this to us on purpose, but they were having a conversation and didn't realize that we were overhearing what they were saying. And his dad was telling his mom that they were looking for this guy that was driving a brown van, and he was abducting kids. So here I am as a 10-year-old, and I'm like, man, there's a guy in a brown van abducting kids. This is scary, right? And so could you imagine every time I saw a brown van, what was I doing? Man, come on, in those days, we footed it, man. I was walking home. And I saw a brown van, man, I was diving into the bushes, man. Like, come on, I'm not getting kidnapped, right? And so there's these triggering responses that happen in our lives with this amygdala, and we need to understand this. And, you're going, well, what's the spiritual side in this? Well, I'm going to help you understand. But if you don't understand this, some of you, your life is being dominated by this little thing in your brain that's almond-shaped, and it's ruling your life. It is literally ruling your life. It is causing you to lose sleep. It's causing you to lose your peace because you are being constantly triggered by the news, triggered by conversations, triggered by smells, triggered by visuals. The sunset goes down and you're like, oh man, like that totally brought back a memory of this thing and I don't like the way that makes me feel. This is part of the human experience. Is that you and I, our spirit is alive. Our soul is alive. It is eternal. But yet we are trapped in this physical body, and we have to have pastors that are willing to tell you, hey guys, there is another part of this that plays a role, and we need to be aware of it. But here's the thing that I love about this, is that God has not just left us with this little objective thing that gets triggered easily and doesn't know how to determine if it's a real threat or not. But he's given us this other part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. In this prefrontal cortex, which is obviously it's in the front, is the area where intelligently regulates our thoughts, also our emotions. It's the center of logic. And so if you think about it, it's a blessing because it's this prefrontal cortex that God has given us that when I see a spider and my amygdala goes, whoa, hey, you should just fly off the rails and start like burning the house down trying to kill this spider. No, this thing goes, that spider's way smaller than you. And besides, you got a big old shoe. Why don't you go ahead and handle business? Or, hey, you know what? The prefrontal cortex tells me, you know what? That spider's actually more afraid of you than you are of it. And if you just wait a minute and kind of usher it on, it's not coming to you. It's going to go away from you. The prefrontal cortex tells me that when I see a brown van, because it still creeps me out a little bit, when I see brown vans these days, but it tells me that guy probably has either died or he's in prison somewhere, or it tells me that he's not trying to kidnap 47-year-old pastors, Like it just kind of puts things in perspective. Are you guys getting what I'm saying here? Is that there's a very, very real side to all this, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that you've experienced some trauma, some disappointment, some disillusionment in life, and the enemy wants to beat you with these thoughts and get you ruminating on these things. Listen, think about this. If God is trying to bless you with a job, a new job, a better paying job, a job with greater benefits, but maybe you got rejected one time when you went for the job, you went to all the interviews and man, you passed the first interview and the second interview, and then you didn't get the job. That feels pretty crummy. Come on, let's be real, right? So now you're thinking about transitioning from the job that you have, which is a dead-end job. God's trying to bless you, but your amygdala is going, phew, 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 fire, 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 fire. Danger, danger, danger. If you go there, they're going to think you're dumb. If you go there, they're going to reject you. If you go there, you're going to waste all that time going through all those interviews, and it might jeopardize the job you have, so don't do it. Can you see that if you're being ruled by this little thing, that it can actually stop and put up blockades towards the blessings of God? That God is trying to build confidence into you, but if this thing has you worried about everything, you are not going to move forward with boldness or courage because actually your flesh is working against your spirit. And for some of you didn't realize that it's actually that easy. See, Paul, he lays this out as he continues, let's go back to Philippians 4:6. He says, do not be anxious about anything. You're like, man, well, that's easier said than done. Well, especially if this little brain of ours is controlling everything, this fleshly part. But he begins to unpack a different way of living, a different way of thinking. And he's saying, let's bring God in on this first. Let's bring God in on this first. And then on the back end, there's some very practical things that we're going to understand as well. So he says, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, say with me, every situation. See, some of you guys are like, oh, it's only in the tough situations. It's only when I don't know what to do. It's only when I can't figure it out. I'll bring them in. No, he said every situation. How do we handle it? If you're anxious about it, if you're worried about it, you bring God in on every situation by how? By prayer and petition. Prayer means that you're praying, you're connecting with God, you're speaking to him. But also petition means you're asking him. You're asking him. And it says, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. What he's saying with thanksgiving, like, God, I know you can do this, and I thank you that you're going to. By faith, I receive this, God. I'm believing that you're going to break through in this situation. I believe you're going to bring the answer. So I thank you for it in advance. It's a different kind of lifestyle. So we can either choose to live in a life where we are hitting walls and we're stuck because this brain is controlling us, or we can begin to break through and bring God into the situation and to experience life and to experience victory. Why? Because he hears us. If you don't believe me, listen to what it says in 1 Peter 5:7. He says, cast all your anxieties. Some translations say cast all your cares. Cast all your anxieties on him. Why? Because he cares for you. Some of you, you need to hear that today. You feel like God's angry with you and that he's trying to punish you. But in reality, he's saying, if you're worried about something, bring it to me because I care. I care for you. Is it your job situation right now? You guys have a big bill that you just don't have enough money to cover. Is it your health? Is it your children? What's going on? What's troubling you right now? What's causing you to have a racing mind? God is saying to you today, cast it onto me because I care. Listen to what it says in James 4:2. He goes on to say, you do not have because you do not ask. Do you realize that some of you are not living in the blessings of the Lord because you just haven't asked? It's that simple. That God is saying you're not living with what you're actually wanting because you haven't asked me. Put it out there. Begin to believe him. Begin to trust him. Hebrews 4:16 goes on to say this. It says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. If you've got a need, if you've got a concern, if you've got a worry, he's saying, bring it to me. And this is what Paul is laying out for you and I to understand, is that we start here. You start in the spiritual. You start believing God, trusting God, bringing him in, petitioning him, and you're going to begin to see that life is changing. But instead, many of us, we're not doing this, and we are living lives full of worry. A quick definition of worry, and this is the old school definition, is that it's to harass as through rough treatment or attack. So sometimes using this in context, the way that we understood it back in the 1500s is that they would say, oh, look at that dog on the porch worrying that shoe. You're going, wait, what do you mean worrying the shoe? Well, that was the original meaning. It means to attack. It means to harass. It means to like bite, constant biting. And some of us, instead of getting into faith and petitioning God, we're living these lives of constantly being bit by the things that we're worried about. It's just gnawing on you. It's just gnawing on you. Have you ever seen a dog just chewing on a shoe? Just gnawing and gnawing and just ripping it, and that's how some of us are living our lives. And we're going, man, like this Christian life is not fulfilling, man. This is not what it's all cracked up to be. That's not what they put on the brochure. But in reality, if you're not living a biblical life, you're not going to receive the biblical blessings, my friend. And so many of us, we're giving our lives over to worry, but this can change. When we begin to pray, I want you to know that prayer changes things. So much so that it changes even the structure of your mind. For many years, scientists believe that at a certain age, your mind didn't repair itself anymore, that your mind didn't reroute. But we know now, based on studies and scientists, that, man, your brain is constantly rerouting and fixing itself. And that God is healing the mind, but also your brain is doing its part as well. And I love this with Caroline Leaf, Dr. Caroline Leaf. She's a believer, but she's also a neuroscientist, and this lady is brilliant when it comes to the mind. But listen to what she says. It has been found that 12 minutes of daily focused prayer over an 8-week period can change the brain to such an extent that it can be measured on a brain scan. Come on, yo. That's powerful. 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. That's why in Freedom, Freedom is 8 weeks, and we ask our team, we ask everybody that's in it to pray for 12 to 15 minutes a day. Why? Because we know that this works. That it's not just about drudging stuff up and talking things. You need healing to happen in your mind because you've experienced trauma, you've experienced pain and hurtful things that have damaged the brain. And God is saying through prayer, I want to begin to heal the brain. Come on, guys, this is good news. Come on, I got a little golf clap on that, but that's good. Because you're not clapping for me, you're clapping for him. Come on. But understand that Paul is saying, start with prayer. Start to petition God. And here's something that you need to understand, is that a runaway mind is the result of a mind dominated by the flesh. And here's the shift that I want you guys to see today, is that the runaway mind, the racing mind, is a mind that is dominated by the flesh. My question to you today is, are the amygdala and its fight or flight responses dominating your life? Are you gripped with irrational fears, worries, and phobias? Is your peace gone? Do you grit your teeth and tighten your jaw all day? The chances are, if you say yes to this and this is the way that you're living, that your mind is racing because it's being dominated by the flesh. This isn't a slam on you. This is a call forward for you. This isn't me putting you down. It's just sharing the truth with you so you can truly be free. But for some of you, oh, well, I don't have these irrational fears, so I guess I'm good. I'm off the hook. But the reality is that some of you, your prefrontal cortex, it's dominating your life. And so you're so logical that you can't receive anything that is spiritual. God tries to speak to you, and this prefrontal cortex slaps it down. Oh, if I can't, see it, I don't believe it. Well, I'll believe it when I see it. And if God doesn't show up, then you know what? I don't think he exists. And so you have other believers that are kind of like in the middle. And the challenge for them is that they're too logical. They can't receive anything by faith. If it doesn't look worldly, if it doesn't look like what you can, cook up here, they don't want it. They don't believe it. But in reality, both sides of that, you're living a life with the mind that is dominated by the flesh. And Paul warns us about this. He warns us about this. In Romans chapter 8, verse 9, he goes on to say, he says, the mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. See, you don't realize, and I didn't until I got this revelation, that when you're rolling around in bed at night, flipping and flopping, and you're worrying about things, do you realize that mindset is hostile towards God? Because what that mindset is saying is, God, I don't believe that you will, and I don't believe that you can, so I've got to figure this thing out. God, I don't trust your word when you say that you'll never leave me nor forsake me. I don't believe that, so I believe that I'm all on my own on this, and so I've got to come up with a solution. Do you realize that our worrying is actually a sin because we are saying, God, I don't believe in you. I don't believe that you can do what you said you can do, and I don't believe that you love me enough to even care about it. See, we don't look at it that way. We're saying, oh, well, I'm just worrying a little bit, but really your mind is being hostile towards God when you're living according to the flesh. But I love how Paul shifts this. And he says, listen, you don't have to live a life dominated by the flesh. You're a believer. And the Spirit of God dwells inside of you. And you've got a second option. You've got a different option. And that's why he goes on to say in Romans 8:9, if I can get there, he says, you, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit. Come on, that's good news. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you're in a different realm. You've been given access to something different. And that's why I love in Romans 8:5, he talks about the two and gives us hope. He says, those who are dominated by the sinful nature think about sinful things. Okay, let's forget about that. Let's talk about this. But those who are controlled by the Holy Spirit think about things that please the Spirit. This is so good. Is he saying that you have been called to live a life that is pleasing to the Spirit. And so if we know that those who have a runaway racing mind, that their mind is dominated by the flesh, we understand that a renewed mind, if I get that slide up, a renewed mind is the result of a mind dominated by the Spirit. So if you want to live a life with a renewed mind, understanding that your mind leads to action, then it must be a mind that's dominated by the Spirit. This is amazing if you think about it. If you started to think in every scenario, every situation, God, is this pleasing to you? Your life would begin to change. And I would venture to say that many of you wouldn't worry about some of the things that you're very much concerned about right now. And so what I'm going to do as a believer from this point, because I want to be pleasing to God, that's the spiritual part. What's the practical part of this? Is I'm going to use my prefrontal cortex. I'm going to use my logic that when the amygdala is just firing off and saying, be afraid, worry about it, be scared. Don't step out. Don't be bold. Don't be courageous. My prefrontal cortex, I'm going to use this part of my brain, my logic center, to say, shut up. You are not going to dominate my life, not one more day. You are not going to be used to trigger me to the point of where I'm living below the standard of what God's called me to do. I'm not going to allow this little response, this little thing the size of an almond in my brain to control and rob me of all the blessings and the peace of God in my life. I'm going to use this brain right here to actually get it to submit to the things and the will of God in my life. And if that thought is not pleasing to God, then man, that thought has to go. I'm taking that thing captive and I'm making it be obedient to Christ. I'm not going to allow my mind to run and race around. How many of us as believers do that consistently? Your mind is all over the place. And God is saying, I'm giving you the power to focus on my will, to focus on my word, and you will see the peace of God land on your life. That's why in Philippians 4:8, Paul continues and he gives us some more instruction. And this is beautiful. You've got to get this. He says, finally, brothers and sisters. So remember, he says, don't be anxious about anything. So take it to the Lord. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Petition him with thanksgiving in our hearts. But then he goes on to say this. Finally, brothers and sisters, if you're a believer today, he's speaking to you too. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. This is incredible. God has built in a thought filter into the Bible. That when you capture that thought, when that prefrontal cortex locks in, boom, nope, I don't know if you're of God or not. I'm going to force it through the filter. No, this thought is not right. It's got to go. You know what? No, this thought is not pure. Nope, it's got to go. This filter catches our thoughts. It's not lovely. No, it's got to go. I'm capturing it, and I'm going to make this thought be obedient to Christ. But what if it is? It's a thought that's admirable. It's something that's praiseworthy. It's not down-talking somebody, but it's lifting people up. You're like, yes, we begin to implement these things into our lives. And so we're careful with what we ruminate on. We're careful with what we introduce into our lives. And parents, could I talk to you for a second? Can I be candid with you as a pastor? Let me be real with you. You must strongly consider what your children are watching and what they're hearing. Because they don't know that they have an amygdala and a prefrontal cortex. So when scary and demonic images are presented to them, that fear grips their heart. And they don't know how to process it. When they hear stories about a kidnapper kidnapping kids with brown hair, or they hear the stories of a serial killer, or they hear these dark and demonic things, maybe that's something that is entertainment for you, and your prefrontal cortex is at a point to where you're like, that's just a movie. Right? Your logic, it's just a movie. They're just acting. It's not real. And you may even say that to your children. It's not real. It's not real. They're just acting. But inside, that part of their brain doesn't know that. Because you got to remember, the amygdala, it's not objective. It doesn't have the ability to recognize a real threat or a threat that is not really a threat at all. It just fires. And so what we don't realize is that some of the choices that we're making, some of the things that we're allowing our kids to view and to hear, what we don't realize is we're setting them up for a lifetime of being triggered by all of these things. It's got really quiet in here. But this is the reality, is that we have to care enough to use our own logic and our desire to please God, to teach them how to please God, to where it doesn't feel like it's rules, but in all actuality, you're helping them live. Do you guys see this? You're breathing life into them by doing the right thing. It's not just like, oh man, I became a Christian, man, I can't do anything anymore. Well, if you're dominated by the flesh, of course you want to do what the flesh is doing, but when you're dominated by the Spirit, your soul, life's purpose is to please God. And when something's not pleasing to him, you're like, you know what? I really like that band. I like going to that concert. Man, I really like that movie. Man, that's one of my favorites. Because you have these emotional attachments to it, but your kids don't. You're like, oh man, I remember when we used to sit around and watch this with my dad. Have you guys ever watched back on some of the movies that you were raised on? You're like, oh my gosh, like you thought that thing was wholesome. And then you watch it now through different eyes and you're like, that thing was perverted, man. That thing was bad. It's because in those days you weren't a believer. And sin was prevalent in your life, but now you've been renewed and you've been restored and you've been washed and you've been cleansed. And so we live differently. How does this play out? In my own life, our life, Stephen, our son, when he was little, we realized he had a really vivid imagination. And I don't know about you, but if you're a parent, you've probably experienced this. I remember being asleep and I could feel somebody was watching me. And I remember opening my eyes, and I was like, oh, man, it's dark in the room, but yet I can still see these two big brown eyes, looking at me. It was like, oh, it scared me. I was like, oh, fight or flight, right? He's triggering my amygdala. And he would say, Dad, I'm having a bad dream. And so I started praying for him. I was like, oh, come here, Stephen. And I would pull him close, and I'd pray for him. I said, okay, now go back to bed. And he would leave. About 5 to 10 minutes later, he would come back. And I'd feel somebody's looking at me again, and I'd open my eyes, and there he is. And he said, they're still there. And we started realizing, he had a vivid imagination. And so it wasn't just enough to pray with him. We had to add wisdom and some practicality to what God was asking us to do in parenting him. And so Veronica and I realized that anytime, it wasn't a scary movie, but if there was intense scenes, like maybe a car chase, or there was something that would stir those emotions and make him feel a little afraid, man, we knew in the night, we weren't going to be sleeping that night. And so we made a decision to say, you know what, we're going to honor God by watching what we're watching, paying attention to the conversations we were having in front of him before he went to bed. And we noticed that just in the practical sense, we had peace. And he began to sleep well. And we slept well. And this was a good thing. Can you see how the Spirit led us to actually make some important changes? But also, we had to be willing to make those changes and think through them and love him enough to realize that, you know what, he's not strong enough and doesn't have the understanding. So we've got to stand and fight for him with the leading of the Holy Spirit. Is this making any sense to anybody here today? Come on. So understand this as I close out, and this is really important, that if you have a racing mind and you've lost your peace lately, and man, you just don't know how things are going to work out in the future, and you're scared, I want you to know that God understands you and that God's eye is upon you, and he promises to help you through this. You are not alone. But in these times, and when I'm talking about the peace of God coming upon your life, man, this thought dropped in my spirit yesterday, man, and I know it's the Holy Spirit, and I want to share it with you. I wish somebody would have shared this with me years ago. But when it comes to the peace of God, if I can get that up, that living in the peace of God is waiting in the middle of the worst, trusting that God's best is on its way. Come on, this is so important for some of you to hear today. Because, man, you are worried about things that you're going, man, I should rightfully be worried about this. Man, we got no money in the bank account right now, and I've got $5,000 that is owed by Friday. I don't know how this is going to work. We just got a diagnosis, and I don't know if this person in my family is going to survive. We just got notice that there might be layoffs, and you're going, it's rightful for me to be concerned and worried. Well, you're concerned, and then you hand it over. And I think that too many of us, we're concerned about things and then we give it to God and then we take it back. And there's this waiting period that some of you are in. And I just want to encourage you today to keep waiting. Keep waiting. Don't give up. Living in the peace of God is waiting in the middle of the worst. Man, some of you guys are in the worst season of your life, including us. Come on, let's be real. But man, God is worthy to be trusted, and I put my confidence in him, knowing that what we're praying for and what we're believing for, it's on its way. And if I don't see it yet, then I will still wait. And if my situation doesn't look like I want it to look like, I'm still going to wait. Let me get some word in you today. Psalm 34:10, what an encouraging verse. The young lions lack and suffer hunger. What does that mean? A young lion is able. A young lion, when they're young, that's when they're their strongest. That's when they're their fittest. That's when their teeth are the sharpest. That's when their eyes are the brightest and have the ability to focus. And he's saying even when they're at their strongest, they still suffer and they still go hungry. But he's saying this, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. I want you to know today that if you're waiting, come on, and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're like, man, like, I don't know how this is going to work out. God is saying that, you know what? The strong suffer, but he's saying, but those who seek me, whether you're strong or weak, if you seek me, you're not going to lack any good thing. That is hope. That is a good word for us today. Isaiah 40:31 held on to this word when I was about to lose my life. It says, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. Man, if your body is just tired and you are sick and you're sick and tired, come on, and tired and sick, you just keep waiting. Because I'm going to wait when I'm in the worst, knowing that God's best is on its way. And I'm going to grab that prefrontal cortex and it's going to grab all those triggers in my mind. And it's going to say, no, you will not jeopardize my future. You will not dominate my life. You will not lie to me. You will not make me feel like I'm in a corner with no hope and no options, because I've got the only option I need, and it's God. Come on. Psalm 34:4 as we finish up. I sought the Lord and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. What are you afraid of? What is causing your mind to race today? The word of God has promised you today that he's going to deliver you from it. Will you believe enough to receive that today? Will you trust him enough to believe that whatever you're afraid of, whatever you're worried about, whatever you think is not going to work out, he's saying, I will deliver you from the things that you're afraid of. You afraid of being alone? God will deliver you from being alone. Are you insecure? God will deliver you from being insecure. Do you feel hopeless right now? Do you feel depressed? Do you feel down? God is promising whatever is causing fear in your life, he's saying, I got you. I got you. Worried about your kids? He's got them. Worried about how you're going to pay for college? He's got you. Car's making funny noises? He's got your car. Come on, he's got you taken care of. The question is, will we trust him?